All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about models of disability. So, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation in the talk, you can think of models of disability as how people think and feel about disability more broadly, right? And these viewpoints are generally kind of distilled down into something known as models. So all people subscribe to some type or combination of models of disability, even if they don't have an awareness, right? And that's simply because even if people don't know it, right, they've been socialized based on their upbringing, based on their community, right, to have some kind of response to people living with disabilities. So to start with, one model of disability that was really prevalent, and is still kind of prevalent in some spaces, is known as the moral model of disability, right? It's seen as this idea of disability having some kind of meaning related to a person or family's character, deeds, thoughts, or karma, right? So, for example, um, someone who has a child with a disability, they might feel that it's a result of, maybe divine punishment, right, for something that they've done earlier in life, and that their child was born this way, as a result of things they've done. And from this perspective, disability can potentially carry a lot of stigma, shame, and blame, right? Particularly if the disability is seen as a mark of wrongdoing, right? So, in the Middle Ages, oftentimes a family could potentially be thought of as cursed, right? If they had, congenital disabilities, right? Or their children were born with high rates of developmental disabilities, right? There was this idea that the family had done something to upset gods or had some kind of wrath. But the moral model also can kind of have a positive spin as well, depending on the person, right? So, a soldier who maybe lost a limb in combat, right, or lost a limb protecting a friend, might view their disability that they acquired as a badge of honor, right? Or someone who survives the polio epidemic, right? Someone who survived a major illness, and they're disabled as a result, they may view themselves as a survivor, right? And this function at the moral model may help them, it may make them feel like, that they're a survivor and they can have this really positive association. It's still very prevalent worldwide. You can oftentimes see it depicted in media. So if you've ever seen any like James Bond movies, oftentimes the villains in fights are people living with disabilities, right? This kind of perpetuates that idea potentially of people living with disabilities as potentially being evil, right? Or potentially being worthy of pity. So now we'll move on to talking a little bit about the biomedical model. This is probably one of the more prevalent models, especially in the Western world. And it's largely in a lot of ways replaced the moral model. It's this idea that disability is a pathology and an impairment caused by a health condition, injury, or disease. And this really became more prevalent basically as humans got a better understanding of science and medicine. And a lot of times these old moral beliefs around disability were changed. So today, the biomedical model is kind of the authority in a lot of scientific approaches, when it comes to medicine. And oftentimes it shapes research, legislation, and healthcare when it comes to working with and serving people with disabilities. And also when it comes to this idea of someone who's recently acquired a disability, they may subscribe to this idea of the medical model, right? Where maybe they just want to fix their disability, right? This concept of they want it, right? They want to be done with it as fast as possible, right? So potentially, a member of the deaf community, right? Someone who's interested in getting like cochlear implants. And I'm not saying that someone who does this is working from the medical model, right? But it's that idea of working to fix, a disability which is being used. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the functional model. disability. So the functional model of disability impacts a lot of legislation around the United States and vocational rehabilitation facilities. They subscribe to the functional model. And this is basically the idea of looking at disability in relation to employment, right? And the economic viability or worth of a person. But basically, it's the idea that does your disability prevent you from working, right? From engaging in different functional aspects of your life that will enable you to support yourself. So this is kind of just an easy flow chart for understanding the functional model, right? You got the person, you got the role, right? So if we think of that musician, right, who lost a finger, you know, can they complete certain roles or functions that they used to that they need to for their job? For a musician, it would be no, right? They would experience economic loss, loss of productivity, right? And this concept of disability is very evident for them, But for a school teacher, right? If they lost a finger, they might still be able to function pretty effectively in, their teaching role. So maybe they wouldn't count, right? And so since they can still complete certain roles and functions, yeah, they would count as, a person who does not have a disability under this model. Does that make sense? All right. So this is kind of started in like the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and 78 are kind of built around this idea, right? So through this model, a person with a disability can be provided services to restore health to their kind of this idea of optimal level of functioning so that they can, function effectively within society. Specifically, you can think of like the workplace or school. So there's this idea of the Rehabilitation Act 1973. Um, this kind of helped state and federal vocational rehabilitation systems because it helped establish, okay, who would be eligible for different services. And there was this idea that the disability needed to impact or impair the ability of someone to get employment and maintain employment. So, these offices of vocational rehabilitation, potentially they could help someone, like if we go back to that idea of the musician, find a way to potentially get employed in a different field, right? Find a way to pivot in their career as a result of their newfound disability. There's also something you mentioned earlier, this idea of the social and political model. And this is the idea that basically society is constructed in a way that's disabling, right? And that if there was kind of this shift from the focus of, the individual being the problem to the idea that society is built kind of in an ableist way, and that there are physical barriers that make buildings inaccessible, there are institutional barriers, there are attitudinal barriers, where people with disabilities are viewed as less than, but it's more an issue of society as opposed to the person living with a disability. And under this model, people with disabilities would actually constitute minority group. And this model kind of takes into account the idea that disability is due to external factors. And, kind of these negative societal attitudes are very impactful for people with disabilities. All right, so another little brief check-in. So, true or false, in a vocational rehabilitation setting, most services are working from a functional disability. So, a person who believes that their child was born with a disability due to sins they committed likely subscribes to what model of disability? All right, so now we'll try something a little bit different. So, here's a little case study. So, imagine you're a vocational rehabilitation counselor and you're assigned a new customer. So, in vocational rehabilitation spaces, clients are referred to as customers. This person is a white male in their mid-50s who recently acquired a physical disability at work, and they subscribe to the moral model. Just what are some kind of considerations you would make working with this customer?